Conflict characterizes the relationship between the provincial government and the Vancouver School Board. The issue is money, and the stakes continue to rise. Does the level of provincial funding support the quality of schools Vancouver citizens require? Are there ways to economize without damaging the education of Vancouver students? Has partisan politics invaded school governance to an unhealthy degree? Is co-governance a failed model? Today on Your Education Matters, we bring back a friend of the program to discuss the ongoing impasse. Mike Lombardi is a former teacher and senior staff member at the BC Teachers Federation. Currently, he is a member of the Vancouver School Board and a leader in Vancouver's Italian community. As a trustee, Mike has been public in his support of board policy. Given his broad experience in Canadian as well as BC education, we are pleased to have Mike Lombardi with us on Your Education Matters. Welcome, Mike. The Minister of Education appointed the Comptroller General, Cheryl Wenezenki-Yoland, as a special advisor to the Vancouver School Board, and she has created a report. I'd like you to give the audience a background on why this appointment was made and something about the contents of the report.
Great. Well, thanks, Paul. It's great to be back in the show. 18 months ago in Vancouver, there was an election held, and I ran on a platform with my colleagues of doing the best for Vancouver kids and standing up and speaking on behalf of the kids of Vancouver. Our opponents ran on a campaign of being compliant and doing the government's work. We won that election campaign, and the citizens of Vancouver said, we want a board that's going to provide leadership, stewardship, and advocacy. So, over the last 18 months, we've been hard at work, we've been developing policy, we've been implementing new programs, trying to make our schools the best they can be for student success. And one of the things that became very clear very early is that because of government underfunding, we have a structural deficit, which is impeding our ability to have a budget which provides for student success. So we embarked on an advocacy strategy which started off by meeting with the Minister of Education, meeting with the Premier, we met with the Finance Minister, all the MLAs. We put the case in a very coherent manner, and we had a good discussion, and we encouraged them to have a look at the funding formula and the structural problems. Well, we did that, and nothing came out as a result of that. So what we did is we had to roll up our sleeves and develop a budget, which in our case this year called for $17 million worth of cuts. That's on top of $50 million worth of cuts that we've had to make in the last 8 years, previous boards. And as we went through that exercise, it became quite clear to us that the choices were unpalatable. We were stuck with having to make choices which were going to impact success for our kids. So we engaged the parent community. We had community consultations, we met with our partner groups, we met with parent groups, we met with students, and the message back to us was, you need to be getting more funding for the schools of Vancouver. So we basically engaged with them on an advocacy campaign. We encouraged parents to contact the minister, the premier, the MLAs, and quite frankly, it was a very successful campaign. More than 1,000 emails, letters, and meetings were held. And I think the frustration point reached with the Minister of Education. And so as a strategy for dealing with our advocacy, she appointed a special advisor. That has the effect of a commission or a committee. It all of a sudden stops the conversation. So and even the way the special advisor was appointed was very interesting for us. Instead of getting a call and being told about it, we found out about it after the media found out.
Well, let me back you up a little bit, because I think a person listening might say, well, weren't there behind the scenes communications and discussions between the school board and the minister and her staff? Wasn't there some sort of ongoing dialogue to try and work these things through before it went to such an extraordinary measure as a special advisor?
Oh, absolutely. We had been meeting, our staff meeting regularly with the deputy minister, other staff. We were meeting with the minister, other cabinet officials, and so there was lots of dialogue going on, but it became clear to us that the minister had made a decision that instead of doing her job, which is advocating for extra funding for education at the table, that she was going to basically try to put the heat back on and divert it to us. So she appointed a Comptroller General to do the report. When that happened, as a board, we were quite surprised that we weren't consulted about that, but once the advisor came in, we met with her, and seems like a nice enough person. She brought in her team of 10 accountants who stayed at the Vancouver School Board office for 6 weeks, and basically interviewed us, interviewed staff, and talked about things. Now, many of us hoped that she would potentially shine a light on some of the challenges that the board faced with its budget and so on, but it became clear that her terms of reference explicitly prohibited her from looking at the elephant in the room, and that is the adequacy of funding for public education in the province and the funding formula. So we went ahead, had the consultation. When the report came out, I was quite shocked, because it seemed to me, and the board was also, that the report, rather than dealing with the substance of the issue at hand, had a lot of other inflammatory language and recommendations in there, which really is having now the potential of diverting away from some of the practical recommendations that are in there. So its tone, inaccuracies, misleading statements, recommendations without substantial evidence behind it, I think is of concern to us. So what we're now trying to do is roll up our sleeves. We've got to adopt a budget. We're working our way through that.
The Vancouver Sun picked up on the issue of stewardship in an editorial and said that the board really owes its stewardship to the people who elected it, whereas the report of the special advisor seems to suggest the stewardship would go elsewhere. Where does the special advisor think the stewardship should go? Well,
that's a very interesting question, because I think one of the things that the Comptroller General didn't get, and that is that we are an elected board, and that there's a difference between an elected board and an appointed board. And what she basically said is there's no role for advocacy, just stewardship. I think our view, and I think corroborated by the Vancouver Sun and others, is that we've got at least 3 roles: leadership, stewardship, and advocacy, and they can all work together.
And the Sun suggested your stewardship goes to the people who elected you. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely. Elected representatives are there because they were elected by the citizens of their constituents, and they are responsible to that particular group. At the end of my term, if I decide to run again, the electors will cast judgment on me and how I did.
Another term that comes up in this discussion is co-governance. Co-governance meaning that the ministry as well as the board have to share responsibility. And the problem that's been identified by media as well as others speaking on this is that the taxing authority all resides on the government side, whereas the liaison with the public resides on the board side. How are you reconciling this impasse in the co-governance structure?
Well, that's a really interesting question. When we met with the minister, she basically told us she doesn't understand what co-governance means, which gave us an indicator that whether or not there's a true commitment to that. But clearly, you know, there is a co-governance model. Both players have to step to the table and undertake their responsibilities. The responsibility of the government is to set out a long-term educational plan and predictable and stable funding to make that happen. Our job is to consult with our community and to develop budgets and programs which meets the needs of Vancouver kids, and that's what we're trying to do. But it's my assessment that the government is not undertaking its co-governance role, and as a result, and you'll see one of the recommendations in the report from the Comptroller General is that the government review the co-governance model to see if, in fact, it's still appropriate for British Columbia.
Okay, we'll pick this up in just a moment. Thank you.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Mike, the special advisor said members of the school board have not demonstrated they have management capacity to effectively govern the Vancouver School Board. Her recommendations make balancing the budget appear to be fairly simple. Do you agree? If not, why not?
Well, I mean, that is a crazy comment. The Vancouver School Board has a history of balancing the budget every year, and we're very proud of the fact that we have a what I would call a complicated but useful, open and transparent budget consultation process. We start off with our management staff, drafting some principles, having a look at what we're doing. We meet with our partner groups, we have community-based meetings, and we collect information from parents asking them what they'd like to see in the budget. Then our management staff prepares a budget. We basically have a look at that, we consult around that, and we work our way through that. And I think we do that in a very responsible manner. The board has always adopted a balanced budget, and it's part of the mandate that we have to undertake. I think the problem with it is the fact that the government and the Comptroller General was not able to study the fact that we have a structural deficit which is created by government underfunding. And so we've got a good budget planning process, but if you don't have the adequate funding to meet the needs of your kids, and the government keeps downloading costs that it's not funding, we're always in this problem, which is a shortfall and having to make significant cuts.
Well, this is another problem with co-governance, because the contracts with the employees are negotiated province-wide, but then the local school boards have to accommodate the costs that the province has committed to.
Well, that's a big problem for us. And, you know, one of the big problems is that the government, you know, as you say, negotiated a contract with teachers. They've not fully funded that, especially the increments, which are the steps when teachers move up the scale. They've not funded the full cost of the benefits. They increased the pension contributions. They've not funded those. They've increased MSP rates. They've not funded those. They've asked us to start working at carbon offsets, and yet they're not funding that. So what we've got is a number of downloaded costs that are negotiated provincially, and instead of the government taking its responsibility for funding those, are putting those onto us. So what that means is we've got to take money out of our budget to pay for those kinds of things. And that is patently saying co-governance is not working, because the government is not living up to their part of the bargain.
I know in Ontario that the Toronto School District has run deficits up to $40 million. It's a 300,000 student district, and the government has stepped in year after year to cover that deficit. I think there's something different about our large urban districts, and Toronto is probably more similar to Vancouver than any other city in Canada, of special pressures that exist on an urban school district that has needs that are beyond some of the other districts around the province. Do you think that the cost of doing business in Vancouver is somehow different than it might be in other localities in the province?
Absolutely. I think the unique challenges in the metro area, I think you can look at districts like Surrey and us are significant. We've got a very high ESL population. We've got a significant Aboriginal education population. We put in more for twice as much in special education as the government gives us. We have a significant inner city schools program to give our kids from our inner city schools a head start. So there are some very different realities that are in our district. And I think, unfortunately, the government funding formula does not acknowledge that. And we are not allowed to run a deficit. If we were to submit a deficit budget, we would be fired. Our job is to prepare a balanced budget, so we're going about that, but we're also making the case of the government that unless you provide us with adequate funding, we're going to be making significant cuts to school programs, which are going to have a significant impact on kids.
Well, that's been the approach of the school board for some months that we've all been following this. But the special advisor came in and, as I said, made the cuts look fairly simple. First of all, reduced it from about 3% to 2%, from about $15 million to about $10 million that needed to be cut. And, for example, showed $5.7 million in closing schools. It looked simple. Why isn't it simple?
Well, it's always can be made to look simple. It's complicated and it's complex, but it can be done, and we're doing it. What we're looking at are some significant cuts, as I pointed out a little earlier. Now, in relation to the school closures, as you know, closing a school is one of the most significant things you can do in the community. The former board, which was in before us, which was an NPA-dominated board, more conservative board, refused to make cuts in schools. Management recommended they close 2 schools, and after community consultation, they decided not to close those schools. What we've decided to do is take a responsible look at facilities planning. We've asked our district to develop a district audit, looking at all of our facilities, and bring us back a plan with recommendations. In the meantime, we've also modified our school closure policy because the Ministry of Education said we needed to revise it, and there's been some significant legal challenges in a couple of communities where the parents have gone and said the board had an inadequate policy and timeline for closing schools. So what we've got is we've got a policy in place now, and at our June 23rd meeting, our superintendent will be bringing us a list of schools for closure in the subsequent year. one of the things the Comptroller General implies is that we can just close schools over the next 3 weeks. Well, that's an impossible task, and it would be totally unacceptable. But we are prepared to look at our facility needs and make school closures as required. The thing that we need to point out, though, again, the inconsistency in government policy. The government said, we need you to have facilities for our neighborhoods of learning. You need to provide for full-day kindergarten, and we'd like you to provide spaces for the programs for 3- and 4-year-olds. Now, our staff have told us if we provide all those kinds of programming, in 2015 we won't have enough space. So the government keeps changing the rules of the game. But in the meantime, we're forging ahead.
Again, we had a similar experience while I was dean at SFU about 3 years ago when the letters of reference were withdrawn. And we had planning done to grow to a certain amount in certain locales and certain fields of study. And then the government changed its mind, and so all of our planning went out the window, and whatever we'd invested in moving in a certain direction, those resources were lost. So we experienced that also in the university setting. Now, in most jurisdictions in North America, if the people of a city like Vancouver wanted to spend more money on their school, they'd simply vote a levy and they'd spend more money on their schools. Do you think we're reaching a point where we need to revisit the way that we fund our schools in British Columbia?
Well, we certainly need a review of the funding formula, and one of the things we asked the minister when we met with her is we asked her for a special grant, one-time grant to help us with our problems right now. She's refused to give us that money, but we've also recommended that the Auditor General or other independent agency do a review of the provincial funding formula to talk about its adequacy. Now in BC, most of the funding comes from the province. 95% of board budgets come from the province. We raise some revenues through some of our sources. But, and we do have the ability to raise taxes, but we have to go to a referendum, which is really a very inappropriate way to raise funds at the local level. But I think a full review of the funding formula is in order because it is broken. I mean, when every school, this is not just a Vancouver problem. Every school district in this province has had to cut funds out of their budget and reduce programming for kids, and that's been going on for 8 years. It's about time the government recognized that and did a review, a thorough review, to come up with the funding formula to meet the needs of our kids.
The last time I saw figures, it was $250 million across all 60 districts. That was the shortfall this year from what the districts felt was adequate.
Yeah, we have an organization called the School District Officials Association, which consists of all the Secretary Treasurers in the province, all CGAs, and what they basically concluded is that the government, prior to announcing its budget, has underfunded boards by $300 million. That's now been revised to $150 million based on the actual budget the government came up with. But the bottom line is boards are having to make $150 million worth of cuts for programming the government is not paying for.
I should say that annually we invite the minister or the minister's representative to appear on Your Education Matters each year that the program has been on. To this point, they have not chosen to appear, but we would graciously extend this invitation again. We'd love to hear the perspective of the ministry. The special advisor also said that the budget shortfall was due to the board's short-term approach to budget planning. Do you think that this is a fair criticism?
Well, I think that's quite interesting when you think of the government's approach to planning. The government keeps changing the rules in terms of its policy requirements. They are not providing stable and predictable funding, and they're encouraging us to do some strategic planning. Well, we wish they'd do some of that, but we are in the process of doing some strategic planning. The Comptroller General made some good suggestions for that, but a good example of how crazy it's become is in August last year, we were sitting down at a strategic planning session with our senior staff. And during the meeting, we had the announcement by the minister that she was pulling back $10 million in the annual facilities grant, and that we would have to make further cuts in our programming in mid-year. So it's very hard to do short, mid, and long-term strategic planning when the rules keep changing. We are happy to do the strategic planning, but the government has to commit to doing their planning and providing a predictable education plan and stable and predictable funding.
About half of my career has been at public universities, finishing here in Canada, but prior to that in the United States. And there always was talk about strategic planning, and we would engage in the exercise. But what I found was that really everything was determined year to year by the conditions in the jurisdiction, whether state or province. There really wasn't much ability on our part at the public university to do meaningful strategic planning at the level that you really would like to be able to do it. Unfortunately, that's not unique to BC, but it seems to be the status of our form of democratic governance in North America. Now, the board is expected to be advocates, as I think everyone recognizes. And the minister is a political leader and with loyalty to her party, and in that sense, she's an advocate too. But the Comptroller General in the role of special advisor, we would look to be impartial and objective. Do you think this standard was met?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it was. I think it's become quite clear. If you look at some of the recommendations in the report, first of all, there are some actual errors in the figures. And our professional staff provide that information to the Comptroller General, and the Comptroller General refused to make the changes. The Comptroller General also made a recommendation that board members should stop operating on a consensus basis with our committees. Well, we made it clear to the Comptroller General. We invited her to come to one of our meetings. We have partner groups, teachers, parents, administrators at our meetings. We asked them for feedback and input, but the trustees make the decisions. So by making a statement about the consensus philosophy of the board, it just was totally out of whack with reality. The other one, which I find really quite amusing actually, is she says that each year there should be an assessment of trustees' skills, knowledge, and abilities. Once that assessment is done, there should be required courses for trustees, and then trustees should report out on how they're doing in relation to that. When we met with the minister, our board chair said, is this going to apply to cabinet ministers, MLAs, and MPs? And we did not get an answer. The public elects people because they have confidence in them. That's the accountability mechanism we had, but it's an example, I think, of the special advisor not understanding the difference between an elected board and an appointed board. So I think when you read a report like that, you can see the flaws in it because of basic misunderstanding of some very basic facts. So unfortunately, I think the report is being perceived as being flawed, although there are some good recommendations in there. And the good ones we're looking at, we've informed the minister of the 29 recommendations targeted at the board. We have either undertaken or are in the process of considering at least 20 of them. So we're moving forward, but we want them to move forward with the recommendations for the board, for the ministry, because one of the key recommendations is that the minister provides stable education planning for the province. And if we had some of that along with the funding, we might be able to get something done.
Well, as I say, in all the years I was in this situation with public universities, I never saw it but year to year, and that seems to be the nature of the beast, unfortunately. I wondered if you got a chance as school board members to review a draft of the document, to input, and whether informed changes were made. When I've been a part of processes like this, the best ones have this review element to them where there's feedback. So it also protects the evaluator, or in this case the special advisor, from making obvious errors or the kind of mistakes that anyone can make when looking into someone else's organization. So was this part of the feedback loop completed before the report went public?
Well, that's a really important point, Paul. One of the things that occurred was that there was no review by the board or our staff at all. The draft report was discussed with the minister by the Comptroller General. The minister confirmed that, but at no time did we get any opportunity to review the findings or observations or the drafts. Had we done so, we would have been able to comment about some of the misleading information in it. The other thing which was quite disappointing for us is the report went to the minister on the Thursday. She did not release it to us until 5 minutes before she had her press conference the following day. So I think what it goes to show here there is that, you know, the kind of fairness and reasonableness that you would expect in terms of input and feedback and sharing of information was not in place, and it makes you question what was the agenda here.
Well, standing back as a career education administrator, what I notice in the whole process is a breakdown of communication, insufficient dialogue, and so on. This example that we just gave is about the third example we've had here of where better communication techniques could have ironed out the wrinkles and made for a report and intervention that was more likely to have success rather than to simply prolong the conflict and take it even to a higher level. For example, the Learning Roundtable was created after the 2005 job action as a vehicle for facilitating communication among the stakeholders except for higher education, which was excluded. Is the Learning Roundtable contributing to communication of this sort?
Yeah. Well, I think, unfortunately, again, the Learning Roundtable, which was an idea, like you say, which came as a follow-up of the strike, at this particular time, some of the key stakeholders are not participating. The BC Teachers Federation is no longer participating. QPBC is no longer participating. So you're having a table with many of the partners missing. But I think the larger point you make, Paul, is an important one. We have said to the minister repeatedly, we want to set up meetings with you on a regular basis. The other thing is the minister is actually an MLA of Vancouver, so one of our responsibilities is to make sure that the minister, as an MLA of Vancouver, is aware of the needs and issues in Vancouver. And we have said we are prepared to meet with you on a regular basis. Her office is 3 blocks away from ours. Our chair phones her on a repeated basis. Unfortunately, the minister, other than at very few times when the conflict level has gotten to a point of no return, is when she tends to meet with us. But clearly, there is a place, an important place for communications, and part of advocacy is working within the system. And that was our goal, but once you work within the system and you don't know the other partner's not listening, then you have to start to look at other forms of advocacy which get their attention. And we got their attention, and we got a special advisor.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us, Mike. Appreciate it.
Good, you're welcome, Paul.
We'll be back in a moment. No government policy can go on unchanged indefinitely. The current co-governance model used for BC schools is in need of a reevaluation and change. Local voters grant school trustees governance responsibility for the schools, but the province retains sole taxing and funding authority. It is a recipe for conflict. Add to this formula the responsive democratic grounding of school trustees and compare it with the top-down executive rule of provincial government. It's no wonder we see the government continually threatening the few independent political voices in BC. Among these are the school trustees. It is time to free towns and cities to tax themselves to fund the schools they want, while continuing to guarantee a reasonable floor on all school funding. It's also time to revisit our collective bargaining model and make it more responsive to local conditions. As Tennyson wrote, "The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world."